Greetings, fellow friends of the stars. This is Rick Levine with your mid-month update for June of 2019. I am recording this in Glastonbury, England, and for those of you who know, this is an incredibly magical place with a magical history and an actual zodiac that spreads out across the countryside. Um, Today is actually June 17th in the evening, late afternoon here in England, which means that it is midday um, um, for those of you back in the States. And I wanted to wait until after the full moon so that we could take that energy and run it up toward the end of the month and into early July. We will have at the beginning of July an eclipse. July is the beginning of eclipse season for us this year. And on July 2nd, we will have a new moon eclipse that is at 10 degrees, 10 and a half degrees of Cancer. And actually in the middle of July, on July 16th, we're going to have a full moon eclipse on 24 degrees of Capricorn. And again, I'm mentioning this now because this is still the Cancer-Capricorn axis, and that full moon eclipse will be in line with Pluto and Pluto in Capricorn. In fact, the moon will be conjuncting Pluto just a few hours before the eclipse. And I'm mentioning that right now because in order to move forward, we have to get through some pretty intense time here right now in the middle of June. The full moon itself that was earlier today was an interesting full moon because it didn't necessarily on the surface look like it was something incredible and powerful. However it was, and I want to start off looking at this full moon that is just passed and go from there because we have a real rock and roll week ahead of us. Things are pretty crazy. Things are pretty intense. They've already been intense. And I think that they'll pretty much stay intense all the way up until the beginning of summer here in the Northern Hemisphere when the sun moves into the sign of Cancer on June 24th. Yes, on June 21st. And that's at 11:54 a.m. The times that I'll be giving are Eastern Daylight Time, even though I'm in England. And I think most of the people who watch this are in the States, but those of you who are not need to adjust your time zones accordingly. Just as a quick aside, I just finished up a weekend at the Astrology Association of Great Britain's annual convention, and it was an amazing event. And I'll be here yet for another week in England doing some teaching and some exploring on my own. One of the themes, though, that has become more and more prevalent at astrology meetings and gatherings and on video such as this is the upcoming conjunction of Saturn and Pluto, which I will be continuing to talk about more each month. But we are already in the midst of that. And this week in particular, we are feeling that quite extraordinarily. Okay, so we are now looking at the chart for the Sagittarius full moon that occurred earlier today. It was at 4:30 a.m., and that's Eastern Daylight Time. This chart shows that the moon has just passed Jupiter, adding to its energy, and it is obviously in opposition to the sun. However, other than that, the distinguishing thing about this full moon is that there really are no other aspects directly to the moon. However, that does not mean that it is an insignificant full moon, because we have a very significant thing cooking that's obvious, and then we have an even more significant thing that's that's going on that's not obvious at all. The obvious thing is that during this lunation, we have the nodal axis and Mercury and Mars all moving opposite the Saturn and Pluto in Capricorn. And what's intriguing about this is that on the surface, it looks like this is a done deal, meaning that that Mercury at 19 degrees is already past Saturn, and Mars is past its opposition to Jupiter, and yet they both have yet to encounter an opposition to Pluto. And this, I think, is going to be hugely significant, and I think it's going to be maybe the singular most important piece of this month is as that occurs. The actual oppositions of Mercury and Mars to Pluto occur very close to one another because Mercury actually catches up with Mars. This is down here. Mercury catches up with Mars tomorrow or on June 18th, and they both then oppose Pluto on the 19th. And we'll look at those charts exactly in a moment when I go back into animation mode. But right now, we want to just be aware that this full moon has the energy of this incredible opposition of Saturn and Pluto and the South Node opposing the North Node and Mercury and Mars. And the Mercury and Mars in particular are falling right in between there, which makes that opposition even stronger. And I think that this energy is going to build until we might have already felt some resistance coming up to the full moon as Mars opposes Saturn and opposed Saturn, and Mercury has done the same. But it's the oppositions of Mercury and Mars, Mercury communication, Mars action. This is putting thoughts into action. Whether these actions are proper actions or healthy actions or not is something secondary. The primary thing is that we can take that passive aggressive Cancerian energy that we may have been holding in our anger, and as Mercury and Mars line up and move opposite to Pluto, we may say something, do something, or take actions that might create more of an upheaval or more of a stir. This has to do with power struggles. This is not an easy energy, and this energy will build through the week. In fact, even though the actual opposition between Mercury and Mars occurs on June 19th, and that would be on Wednesday, it's not until the 21st, when the sun moves into Cancer and Neptune turns retrograde, that I think things become a bit gentler. So I'm going to now go back into the animation mode. I said there were two things. One is the obvious thing, and the obvious thing is that we have planets clustered around 18 degrees of Cancer, 18 to 22 degrees, but 18 degrees of Capricorn, 18 degrees Jupiter of Sagittarius, 18 degrees of Pisces, that would be Neptune. And these planets are all squaring, opposing, sextiling, and trining one another in an incredibly potent combination of Saturn in its own home sign and Jupiter in its home sign, and Mars in a sign that it's not particularly well expressive in, so that energy is holding on and building up while it is also moving through the trine, even though it's just past the trine to Neptune in its own sign. So this is a very powerful configuration. But I want to switch here to looking at this in a different. Normally, we look at aspects that are the traditional aspects astrologers use, aspects that in effect divide into a circle evenly. So an opposition divides into a circle twice. That's a second harmonic, and a trine, the trine between the Cancer planets and Neptune. Trines are 1/3 of a circle, so 3 goes into 12 evenly. And the square between Jupiter and Neptune, which is a very powerful theme throughout this whole year that was actually is just coming into exactitude now. This square, which plays in and out 3 times throughout the year, is a bit about our taking our ideas and our thoughts and our philosophies, Jupiter, and basically moving them into the realms of dreams and imagination and fantasy. This makes it sometimes difficult to know what's real. We'll come back to that theme again and again, as we have over the past year. But the division by a square is 4. 4 goes into 12 evenly. Even the quincunx between these Cancer planets and Jupiter in Sagittarius, a quincunx, which means 5/12, is based still upon a division of 12. It's 5/12. However, if we divide that circle by 5 or 7, we get a different picture, and we need to take a look right now at dividing this circle into a division of 7. Okay, so we are looking at the identical chart that we were looking at before, but the lines in the middle are all different because they're showing an unfamiliar pattern, which is based upon dividing a circle by 7. Now, I just want to show you how this works here real quickly, which I'm going to just draw over here. There's a 7-pointed star. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 points on that star. Between each of those points, there's about 51.3 about that degrees. It doesn't divide evenly into 360. So 7 is a rather unastrological number. It's certainly non-zodiacal in as much as it doesn't fit into the zodiac, but it's also non-decimal because it doesn't come out evenly. It's not an easy to work with number. Now, when we look at the septiles, what we see is something very interesting and very powerful. And the first thing, and basically, as always, the thicker these lines, the closer the aspect is to exact. The first thing that we need to look at here is this line right here between Pluto and Uranus. Now, remember, Pluto and Uranus had been moving in and out of being square from 2015 to from 2012 to 2015. They were moving in and out of being square. A square is a 90-degree angle, 90 degrees. But now, because Uranus is moving faster than Pluto. Uranus is moving away from that 90-degree angle, and right now their angle is about 101 plus, a little bit more than 101, which actually turns out to be 2/7 of a circle, or a biseptile. A septile is 1/7 of a circle. Now, what this actually means is that Uranus and Pluto being biseptile are important enough because septiles are aspects that the famous astrologer, 20th century astrologer Dane Rudhyar called septiles the angle of fate. It's an aspect of fate. Things seem to happen for no apparent reason. Now, there are reasons, but they're not necessarily within our scope of understanding. Often things seem to come from other dimensions and create things that just happen out of the blue. Sometimes these threads of expression involve alien abductions and ghosts and goblins and other worldly things. David Bowie is a good example of a chart with very strong septiles, and he certainly was an alien or a spaceman. Michael Jackson, who lived in Neverland, also strong septile chart. Septiles are otherworldly. They're complicated. They're supernatural. But here's the thing that makes this even more interesting. Because into this we have the sun moving over the next day or so into a septile with Uranus, which will thicken up that line, and then into 3/7 of a circle, a triseptile with Saturn. So that this triangle that involves Pluto, Uranus, and the sun become 3 points on that 7-pointed star. Um, and this is important, unusual. It's unusual because it has these outer planets of Uranus and Neptune, and the sun moving into position, the exact biseptile between Uranus and Pluto is actually right about now. It's June. No, it was actually yesterday. It was exact. It was exact yesterday on June 16th. But right now, even currently, they're barely 1 minute of arc apart. So they're still, obviously, they move slowly. They're very, very close. The sun, let me come back now to the animated version here. If we move this ahead a day at a time, you'll be able to see that by the 18th, look how thick those lines have become, because the sun is now exactly septile to Uranus and exactly triseptile to Pluto. The aspect from Uranus to Pluto is still within 4 minutes of arc. That's 4 minutes of arc is like 1/15th of a degree. So they're really, really close. And I would suggest that over the next few days, whether it's in our personal lives, whether it's culturally, whether it's politically, there's certainly a lot of tensions building up politically all over the world. And certainly here in the I say here in the United States, I'm in England, but certainly in the United States. And I think the combination of the conjunction between communicator Mercury and angry warrior Mars that becomes exact, that conjunction becomes exact later in the day on the 18th. I'll animate this forward in just a moment. But those two planets then become exact opposite Pluto on the 19th. And I think that we will see something out of this that again, whether it's global issues, it's not lost on me that with this energy cooking, yesterday there was a major power outage that made Uruguay and most of Argentina absolutely go down, go black completely. And this, I think, is partly the results of not only coming into the full moon, but the Mercury-Mars opposing Saturn and Pluto, because all of this is adding to this picture. Now, I'm going to take away the septiles and go back to our regular chart, the way we're normally looking at a chart. And we see here that now we're on Tuesday, June 18th, and I'm going to move this ahead just a few hours at a time because I want you to see the progression of Mercury getting closer and closer to Mars. It joins Mars midday. This chart right now is 4:30 a.m. And as we move this an hour at a time forward, that Mercury becomes closer and closer and closer. Here it is, Mercury is 21 degrees, 24 minutes. Mars is 21 degrees, 27 minutes. An hour later, Mercury is 21, 27, and boom, an hour later, they are within 1 minute of arc. We're now June 18th at noon or at 11:30. We could actually change that to noon. And the actual conjunction itself occurs just a couple of minutes after noon. You can see here at noon, they are 21 degrees and 31 minutes. If we move this an hour later, watch Mercury move from this side of Mars to that side of Mars. as Mercury joins Mars and catches up with it. Okay, so this event is on June 18th, June 19th. June 18th is the exact conjunction of Mercury and Mars, where we express our anger, or we, in some ways, are really thinking things, and the energy is really, really powerful, but that Mars in Cancer may not be able to express it easily. We may, in fact, know what's right and know what we want to say, but with that Mars and Mercury opposition to Pluto, it may be socially, culturally, emotionally, spiritually not okay for us to express ourselves, and we may hold it in even more. But what that does is that builds the energy, and there certainly can be a powerful release when Mercury actually, I'm going to continue moving this forward an hour at a time, when Mercury actually reaches 22 degrees in 30 minutes and goes opposite Pluto. Mercury hits that point first. There, Mercury, late on the 18th, Mercury moves, boom, there it is, at 10 p.m., moving into the 22nd, 22 degrees of Cancer. And as we continue that on, by the way, moving into this picture is the moon, which after the new moon in Sagittarius, the moon moved into Capricorn. And to make matters even more powerful, more intense, we have the moon moving through Capricorn, it joining with Saturn at 11:53 p.m. That's just before midnight on Tuesday, June 18th. So late on Tuesday 18th, late at night, the moon will catch up with Saturn, and watch that moon move past it. But at the same time, we're watching Mercury. There's the moon moving past Saturn. It's now sandwiched between Saturn and Pluto. And now as we move that onward, we're just going to keep our eye down here on Mercury, and Mercury at 22 degrees, 20 minutes. And there it is right there in the evening on June 17th. The actual opposition is exact at 6:55 a.m. on Wednesday, June 19th. We're showing this chart for 7 a.m. Mercury is now opposite Pluto, and the moon is only 9 minutes of arc away from its conjunction to Pluto. We move this an hour ahead, and boom, the moon is past its conjunction. And at the same time, we have Mars sliding in. The energy is still building here, and it builds all the way up until, we'll move this through an hour at a time, and Mars actually conjoins, exactly opposes Pluto late on the evening of June 19th. It's 11:26 when it's exact, right here at midnight. The last moment of June 19th, or the first moment of June 20th. You can see here now Mars is exactly opposite Pluto. The moon has moved into Aquarius. It does that at 10 p.m. on Wednesday evening. That begins the flavor of easing the energy. But remember, Aquarius is still a fixed sign. And so we may have done something, or someone may have done something to us as triggered a reaction, and we hold on to that feeling, even though that moon moves from its conjunction to Saturn and Pluto. When that moon moves into Aquarius, we know what we did is right. We don't have any regrets yet, and especially with that Mars still lingering in its opposition to Pluto. On June 20th, it's a relatively quiet day, but all this energy isn't just going away. We'll be feeling this through Thursday, and in fact, by late morning on Thursday, by 8 o'clock, the moon in Aquarius is now moving into an exact square with Uranus. And so we still might be getting some crazy disruptive energy here that is not all that easy. And remember, behind all this, we still have Jupiter squaring Neptune. Even though Jupiter is retrograding back away from that, it's still within a half a degree. These planets are moving slowly. And on June 21st, Neptune begins its retrograde dance. It doesn't retrograde as fast as Jupiter does, so this square continues to widen but it widens slowly. Let's move this an hour or so back, and we get to June 20th. We're still kind of feeling the energy from the other day, but it's beginning to mellow out a little bit. By late in the afternoon, into the evening, the moon begins in Aquarius, begins to pick up on a trine to Venus, and then later it'll pick up on a trine to the sun at the very, very end of Gemini. But that sun at the very end of Gemini is a bit unstable right now, because we are here on the last day of the first quarter of the zodiac, meaning that the first 3 months, Aries, Taurus, and Gemini, are about to change. And when there's every 3 months, when the sun changes signs, that actually begins a new season, and we move from the season of spring in the northern hemisphere, opposite obviously in the southern hemisphere, is Aries, Taurus, Gemini. And we're going to just watch here as the sun, hour by hour, gets closer, and boom, there it is right there. The sun moves into Cancer, and it does that actually at 11:54 a.m. Eastern Time is the actual summer solstice. And I will be at Stonehenge watching the sunrise, God willing, watching the sunrise from the center of the stones in Stonehenge on the solstice morning. Now, the other thing, though, is that aside from this beginning a new season, we have the energy of the Mars and Mercury beginning to wane. It's beginning to wind down a little bit and soften. Mercury is a good 3 degrees away. That's still there. It's still working. Mars is only a degree away, but those energies are beginning to settle down. And at the same time, Neptune turns retrograde. Neptune, which is in a close sextile to Saturn, which in some ways is a saving grace here, because it does help stabilize those fantasies and make them not quite be as crazy. I mean, we have a mixture of energies here. If there was only one planet in one sign, or only one aspect at a time, doing astrology would be easy. But we have all this tension from these planets moving through Cancer, opposing the Saturn, Pluto, and hitting the nodal axis in Capricorn, which is very, very tense. I mean, this is like hitting the wall, being angry, having resentment, wanting to face a power struggle. It's not an easy energy here. At the same time, we have Jupiter squaring Neptune. Squares typically aren't easy either, but this one can be incredibly creative, because we can use our imagination and come up with ideas that can help solve whatever it is that ails us or the world, although we can also get a little mixed up with what's real and what's not. By the way, in this whole period of time, as we approach the end of the month, we also have Venus moving through mid-Gemini, coming into an opposition with Jupiter and a square with Neptune, kind of feeding that whole what's real question that we might have. Who's telling the truth? How do you figure out what's really going on? You know, is this good or is this bad? This person is saying this about someone else, and the other person saying something completely different. And although we think we know, I would suggest here, as June unfolds, I think it's important to keep in mind that even if we know, we don't necessarily know. It's tricky territory, because we don't want to buy into things that are fake, that are not true. And yet, in our attempt to hold on to what we believe, sometimes we miss some other facts that might be important too. And so I'm just throwing that out there for all of us in this time of great polarity, this time of lack of dialogue between belief systems over so many issues. It's really important to understand that if we allow Neptune and Jupiter to do their work, to give us the ability to think things that we hadn't thought before, by allowing our imagination to take a step forward, and realizing that Neptune sextile to Saturn can actually still ground some of those fantasies, some of those dreams in reality. I think that can be very, very useful. Now, by Saturday the 22nd, the moon moves from Aquarius, there it is right there, into Pisces midday. And as it does, it picks up on a trine with the sun that's just recently, just yesterday, moved into Cancer. And so as we get to the first day, the first full day of summer, the sun moves into Cancer midday on the east coast of the U.S., midday on Friday. But by Saturday, midday, Saturday is the first full day of summer, and the moon moving into Pisces supports that energy by a trine, that big, fat, thick blue line, that really helps us ground our emotions, ground our feelings. Ground maybe isn't quite the right word, but to feel them, to experience them fully. And at the same time, over the next day, Venus is moving into an opposition with Jupiter and squaring Neptune. We're going to run this through still at an hour at a time. And there's Venus moving into 17 degrees. At the same time, we have the moon moving through Pisces, getting closer and closer to its conjunction with Neptune, which doesn't occur until almost midnight. We're here right now. We're at 9 a.m. Eastern time on Sunday morning, and we have Venus forming that opposition to Jupiter exactly by noon. There it is, right there. By 1 o'clock, it's exact at 12:44 p.m. And then as that Venus continues to move on, because Jupiter and Neptune are so closely square, then what happens is that Venus then hits an aspect first with Saturn. It forms a quincunx with Saturn, boom, right there. And that's at 10:30 p.m. And then at 6 a.m. the following day, Venus forms a square with Neptune. And meanwhile, during that period of time, the moon comes across Neptune. This is let's actually unfold this. There is Venus right here moving into 18 degrees of Gemini, forming a quincunx with Saturn. There's Venus at 18 degrees, 22 minutes on Monday, just at the very beginning of the day. Excuse me. Midnight Sunday night, first hours of the wee hours of the morning on Monday. And then Venus then moves into forming that square with Neptune just a couple of hours later. By 6 a.m., that Venus is exactly square. There it is right there. It's exactly square by 6 a.m. to Neptune. So what the hell does all this mean? This means that Venus is really in the spotlight for a couple of days. And with Venus in the spotlight, we can overdo, we can overextend, we can seek pleasure, we can indulge. Venus opposite Jupiter can be wonderful and lovely in a relationship, but we can also have an extra drink too many. Or we could eat an extra portion of something that's too sweet or too sugary or too dense or too this or too that, because Venus and Jupiter, although they are the greater benefic, that's Jupiter, I think of it as the cosmic good guy, and Venus is the lesser benefic. She's the cosmic good gal. I think here it's important to note that Venus isn't lesser than Jupiter because it's a female-male dichotomy. Jupiter is the greater benefic because it's the biggest damn thing in the solar system. There's no question about that. Jupiter is huge. But the fact that Venus is opposing Jupiter and squaring Neptune while the moon is coming through that conjunction to Neptune, we can get so lost in fantasies on Sunday, Saturday night, Sunday, even into Monday, that we just kind of forget what's real. Now, if we're sharing a fantasy with someone who is understanding that it's a fantasy, this can be amazing. This can be powerful. I mean, this is, it's not necessarily specifically romantic love, but it is Venus, but it's Venus in Gemini. It's probably more than likely love of an idea or a thought or a painting or something artful or something. But as Venus moves through that opposition with Jupiter and it's square to Neptune, with the same time with the moon coming in, squaring Jupiter, squaring Venus, and conjuncting Neptune, I think the fantasy side of this is really kind of blown out of whack. There is that Wayne Dyer saying that was in response to the idea that seeing is believing. He said, no, that's not true. Believing is seeing. And I think this is important, especially because Saturn is in this picture, that Venus is quincunx Saturn. We're not going to totally forget our responsibilities. We can't just forget about Saturn here. And Saturn sextile to Neptune may actually indicate that that which we dream, that which we fantasize, that which we think is true, the imagination that there is a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, perhaps, just perhaps, if we put our effort toward it, we can actually manifest our dreams and create them in the three-dimensional world, in reality. So this is a knock your socks off week. I mean, the amount of inner and outer planetary interaction here is quite astounding. It's as much as I've ever seen, although it's not any one event. The barrage really begins or began a couple days before today's full moon, and really continues all the way through the 24th. And by the last hours of the 24th, we're going to move this ahead again an hour at a time. We're going to watch that moon move from Pisces right there, boom, into Aries. And that happens very late a Monday night. And on Monday, there really is not a lot of other energy other than the Venus still kind of holding on to all those aspects. Its square to Neptune occurs early in the morning on Monday, but the moon throughout the day makes harmonious aspects with Pluto and Mars and Mercury. And so I think by Monday, energy is flowing a little easier. And by Monday night at 10:37 p.m., the moon moves into Aries, and this kind of is a clean cut. Now, the other energy doesn't just go away, but something shifts and we can kind of look forward instead of continually looking back and being tied up in the same old patterns. On the 25th, we have the we have the closing square of the moon to the sun. Right there, we can see that the moon at 4 degrees of Aries is squared the sun at 3 degrees. We're off. I moved this ahead too far. There it is, right there. The actual square, the moon square sun, occurs at 5:46 a.m. Eastern time. And this third quarter square is basically the energy has already culminated at the full moon a week ago. Now we're having to make some changes in how we think and what we're going to leave behind and what we're going to take with us. And it's more of an internal thing, except the moon is in Aries, which can be physical. And that moon is also coming up to a conjunction with Chiron on Tuesday, the 25th, which I think can also be a part of a process of letting go in anticipation of the new moon, which is a solar eclipse on July 2nd. We'll talk more about that in the July update or the July forecast by the first of the month. Now, on June 25th, later in the day, we also have Venus kicking back into the picture. We also have Venus moving into a half square with Uranus. This is not noted here, but this might stir up again our desires and our feelings of what we want versus what we can have. This is not a huge thing, but it really is the only other thing cooking on this day of needing to let go of something from the past. The other thing that happens later at night, we do have Mercury, which has been running through Cancer, and Mercury now ahead of the sun. It will be turning retrograde next month. But right now, Mercury running ahead of the sun will actually be the first of the inner planets, often Mercury, always Mercury and Venus, and often Mars run in kind of a pack along with the sun. And Mercury on Tuesday becomes the first planet to leave Cancer and to jump into the next sign. There it is, right there. And Mercury moves into the sign of Leo at 8:19 p.m. Eastern Time. And we begin to get our antenna up about what I like to call the midsummer intensity, relentlessness of the summer sun. We get a sense of the fixed energy coming back into the picture as Mercury moves into Leo. It's like another sign that we're getting to look ahead rather than backwards. And yet just a few hours later, the moon, which is certainly in Aries, eager to look ahead or be in the present moment, the moon moves into Taurus, boom, right there on Thursday, the 27th at 9:30 a.m. And normally the moon moving into Taurus is very comforting and very reassuring. But as the moon moves into Taurus now, it's immediately in the vicinity of Uranus, which can stir things up, and that moon actually joins up with Uranus by 8:30 p.m. On Thursday, June 27th. And at the same time, we also have the sun forming a sextile with Uranus and the moon, which really does allow us to let go of the past. It allows us to maybe process those things we have been holding on to. But the sun also forms a square with Chiron. I don't have aspects to Chiron here showing, but that sun square Chiron, again, is facing our weaknesses, our vulnerabilities, and forgiving ourselves and others, not just in words, but in deeds. On the 28th, the energy really still is rather settled. There's not a lot other than lunar transits as the moon moves through Taurus. It's picking up on some pretty sweet aspects from the nodal axis, Saturn, Pluto, and Neptune. This is all kind of cool. There's not a lot else going on through the 29th. Late in the 29th, actually 5 p.m. in the afternoon, the moon moves from Taurus into Gemini right there just before 6 p.m. on Saturday, the 29th. Mercury also makes a square and a half. Mercury makes a square and a half with Jupiter. We may be overindulging our thinking. We may be having an idea and taking it too far, especially with the moon now in Gemini, heading toward an opposition to Jupiter. That's exact tomorrow, that moon opposition to Jupiter. This is all now about, it's not just that we have hope. We have big ideas. Things are cooking, but we have to be careful not to overextend. And on the this part of the month, the last day or two of the month, is very interesting because we really are quite a bit more hopeful. We can see how the moon comes into that opposition with Jupiter on the evening of the 30th, the last day of June. There it is right there. And that moon now is opposing Jupiter and squaring Neptune, once again firing up those fantasies. But there's something else going on now that feeds us into next month. And that is Mars at 29 degrees of Cancer is getting ready to join Mercury, moving into Leo right behind it. That doesn't actually occur until tomorrow, until July 1st. It occurs, I'm going to move this ahead now a day at a time, but the Mars moves on into Leo, the moon moves into Cancer, and if we move this up now just an hour at a time, we're going to come up to the new moon. There it is right there. That's close enough for now. It's at 3:16 p.m. Eastern Time, 3:16 p.m. Eastern Time. That's a new moon. Whenever that new moon occurs close to the nodal axis, here it's 7 degrees away from the nodal axis. This new moon is an eclipse of the sun, where the moon is visible on the planet in a narrow strip When you look at the sun, don't look at the sun. The moon will come between the earth and the sun, and it will be an eclipse of the sun. We'll talk more about how important this eclipse is and how important the next two eclipses are at the forecast for July. That brings us to the end of the month. It's a rock and roll period. You know, all I can think of is the Dalai Lama, who says, if you can, be compassionate. You always can. So, be kind. Don't just react from the gut, because chances are, with these oppositions to Pluto, we may be experiencing some fear. We may be experiencing some energy that we've been holding in and not expressing. And when we hold in fear and don't express it, it can turn anger. Also, it can turn cold. It can turn to resentment. And so we may find ourselves in a situation where we can overreact. So if possible, be compassionate. It's always possible. And of course, think cosmically, act locally. We're not going to solve the world's problems by thinking about what's happening at the outer edges of our solar system. We're going to solve the world's problems by working very locally in our own relationships, family, in our jobs, and how we live our lives. So think cosmically and act locally. See you in a couple of weeks for the July report. I'm Rick Levine.